Close your eyes for a second. Picture the Wild West. You probably see a cowboy riding into town at sunset. His shirt is pressed. His teeth are white. He tips his hat to a lady, walks into a saloon, and orders a whiskey. It looks cool. It looks free. It looks like a time when men were men. Now, open your eyes, because that is a lie. If you could actually smell that picture, you would vomit. That cowboy hasn't bathed in 6 months. His shirt is stiff with sweat and lice. His teeth are rotting out of his head because of scurvy. And that whiskey he's drinking, it's not aged in oak barrels. It's raw grain alcohol mixed with burnt sugar and chewing tobacco to hide the taste of poison. The Wild West wasn't romantic. It was a sensory nightmare of stench, disease, and filth. Today, we are peeling back the Hollywood paint to show you the rotting wood underneath. Welcome to reality. Let's start with the most obvious thing movies can't show you, the smell. In 1880, the average person didn't smell good, but on the frontier, the stench was aggressive. You have to understand the water situation. Water was heavy, water was scarce, and water was for drinking, not for washing. Most men on the trail went months without a full bath. They would wipe their faces with a damp rag, but the rest of their body was a biological hazard zone. Layers of dead skin, sweat, and dirt would cake together to form a literal crust on their skin. They didn't view this as dirty. They viewed it as protection. They thought this layer of grime kept the cold out and the sickness away. When they finally got to a town and decided to pay for a bath, it wasn't a spa day. It was a communal nightmare. A bathhouse would charge a few cents for a tub of hot water, but water was expensive to heat and carry, so they didn't change the water after every customer. If you were the first guy in the tub on a Saturday night, congratulations, you got clean water. But if you were the 5th or 6th guy, you were soaking in a human soup. The water would be thick, gray, and opaque, filled with the floating lice, tobacco spit, and grime of the 5 men before you. You weren't getting clean. You were just marinating in someone else's filth. And then there were the clothes. A cowboy owned the clothes on his back, and maybe one spare shirt. They didn't do laundry. They wore their clothes until they literally rotted off their bodies, or became so stiff with sweat that they could not stand up on their own. If you stood next to a group of these men in a small room, the smell of ammonia, stale sweat, and unwashed wool would make your eyes water. It was a smell of decay. If the smell didn't drive you crazy, the itching would. Every movie shows cowboys sleeping peacefully under the stars. They never show them scratching. But the reality was that almost everyone, from the richest rancher to the poorest drifter, was infested with body lice. They called them seam squirrels, or crumbs. These weren't just a nuisance. They were a torment. The lice lived in the seams of the clothes, drinking blood and laying eggs. Since men rarely changed their clothes, the population of insects on their bodies would explode. A common pastime around the campfire wasn't playing the harmonica. It was reading your shirt. A cowboy would take off his shirt, turn it inside out, and hold it over the fire. The heat would make the lice pop and explode. That was their entertainment, listening to the popping sound of the parasites that were eating them alive. And it wasn't just lice. Bedbugs were everywhere. If you stayed in a hotel or a boarding house, the mattresses were often stuffed with straw or Spanish moss. These were breeding grounds for bugs. You weren't paying for a bed. You were paying to be the meal for a million tiny mouths. Let's talk about the one thing Westerns refused to show: going to the bathroom. In the 1880s, toilet paper as we know it didn't exist. So what did they use? The answer is whatever was on the ground. If you were lucky, you had an old catalog or a newspaper, but ink was toxic and paper was rare. Most of the time, out on the trail, you used what nature provided: leaves, grass, or the most common tool, a dried corn cob. Imagine the texture of a rough, dried corn cob. Now imagine using that every day. The result was constant irritation, infection, and hemorrhoids. In town, it was worse. Outhouses were dug in the back of buildings, often right next to the water well. I want you to think about that. The hole where the waste went was 10 feet away from the hole where the drinking water came from. When it rained, the ground became saturated. The waste from the outhouse would seep through the soil and drip right into the well water. You were essentially drinking the entire town's sewage. This is why disease killed more people in the West than bullets ever did. So, you've survived the lice and the bad water. Now you're hungry. Hollywood shows steaks sizzling on a fire, beans and coffee. It looks hearty. In reality, the diet of the Wild West was a slow suicide. Refrigeration didn't exist. If a cow was killed, that meat had to be eaten immediately or preserved. They preserved it with salt. So much salt that the meat became like leather. To eat it, you had to soak it in water to get the salt out, which turned it into a gray, tasteless mush. But often, the meat just went bad. It was common to eat beef that was green. It had started to rot. To mask the taste of decomposition, cooks would drown the meat in black pepper and heavy spices. If you ever wondered why Western food is known for being spicy or heavily seasoned, it wasn't for flavor. It was a survival tactic to keep you from vomiting up the rotten flesh you were swallowing. And because they rarely ate fresh vegetables or fruits, scurvy was a plague. We associate scurvy with pirates, but cowboys had it just as bad. Your gums would turn black and spongy. Your breath would smell like a corpse. Eventually, your teeth would loosen and fall out. If you got a cut on your hand, scurvy meant it wouldn't heal. Old wounds you had years ago would literally break open again. The cowboy smile wasn't a pearly white grin. It was a mouthful of gaps and black, bleeding gums. Speaking of teeth, let's talk about pain. If you got a toothache today, you go to a sterile office. In the Wild West, a toothache could be a death sentence. The infection could spread to your brain and kill you. So, the tooth had to come out. But there were no dentists. There was the barber surgeon. The same guy who cut your hair and shaved your beard would pull your tooth. And the tools? He didn't have sanitized extractors. He used a pair of iron pliers that he kept in his pocket, probably covered in tobacco dust and lint. There was no Novocaine, no anesthesia. They would give you a shot of whiskey, which barely dulled the pain, and then hold you down. The barber would clamp onto the tooth and twist. Often, the tooth would shatter, leaving the roots stuck in the jaw. Then he'd have to dig them out. If you needed surgery, say, for a bullet wound or a crushed leg, it was even worse. Doctors in the 1870s didn't believe in germs. They thought pus was a good sign. They called it laudable pus. They believed it meant the body was healing. A surgeon would move from an autopsy of a dead body directly to your surgery without washing his hands. He might sharpen his scalpel on the sole of his boot before cutting into you. The mortality rate for abdominal wounds was nearly 90%. If you got shot in the gut, you didn't see a doctor. You made your peace with God, because the doctor was just going to make your death more painful. Let's step outside the doctor's office and look at the town itself. Movies show us dry, dusty streets where tumbleweeds roll by. They rarely show the mud. These towns weren't paved. In the spring and winter, the streets were a quagmire. But it wasn't just mud. It was mud mixed with the manure of hundreds of horses, cows, and pigs. You were walking knee-deep in feces. Ladies had to lift their skirts just across the street, and even then, the hemlines would be soaked in filth. When the sun came out and dried the mud, it didn't get better. It turned into dust, fecal dust. The wind would whip this bacteria-laden powder into the air. You breathed it in constantly. Dust pneumonia was a real killer. You were literally inhaling the dried waste of the entire town into your lungs every time a stagecoach rolled by. The quote, fresh country air was a myth. So you seek shelter in the saloon, the center of social life. Hollywood shows can-can girls, piano players, and a clean bar. The reality? A saloon was a dark, cramped, terrifying hole in the wall. They were usually small to conserve heat. The air would be thick with cigar smoke, cheap, nasty tobacco that smelled like burning trash, and the spittoons. Spitting was the national pastime. Men chewed tobacco constantly and spat on the floor if they missed the brass pot. To handle this, the floors were covered in sawdust to soak up the mixture of saliva, tobacco juice, and spilled alcohol. When you walked into a saloon, the crunch under your boots was a carpet of dried spit. The whiskey they served wasn't the amber liquid you see in commercials. It was often homemade rot gut. To give it color and a kick, Bartenders would mix raw alcohol with burnt sugar, turpentine, and even gunpowder. Drink enough of it, and you didn't just get drunk, you went blind or mad. The quote, wild behavior in the saloons wasn't just rowdiness, it was often toxic psychosis from drinking poison. Now we have to address the biggest myth of all, the violence. The quote, high noon standoff. Two men in the street. The clock strikes 12. The fastest draw wins. This rarely happened. It is a pure Hollywood invention. Real gunfights in the Wild West were chaotic, clumsy, and usually cowardly. If someone wanted to kill you, they didn't challenge you to a duel. They waited until you were asleep. Or they shot you in the back while you were playing cards. Or they waited in an alleyway with a shotgun. The weapons themselves were unreliable. Black powder revolvers would jam. They would misfire. In the heat of the moment, surrounded by smoke, men would empty their guns from 5 feet away and miss every shot because their hands were shaking so badly. It wasn't cool. It was terrifying. There was no honor in it. The famous gunfighters, like Billy the Kid, weren't heroes. They were usually paranoid drifters who murdered people when they had the advantage. They didn't want a fair fight. A fair fight means you might die. And what about the women? The movies give us the hooker with a heart of gold or the tough rancher's wife. For women in the sex trade, life was a short, brutal tragedy. They weren't glamorous dancers. They were often desperate, addicted to laudanum or opium to numb the pain of their existence. The suicide rate among these women was staggering. They lived in cribs, tiny shacks barely big enough for a bed, and were ostracized by the rest of the town. For the pioneer wives, the women who lived on the homesteads, the enemy was isolation. A woman could go 6 months without seeing another female face. The wind on the prairie never stopped blowing. The silence could break your mind. Prairie madness was a real diagnosis. People would snap from the sheer loneliness and the relentless howling wind. So, why do we hold on to the myth? Why do we keep remaking the same movies with the clean shirts and the honorable duels? Because the reality is too hard to look at. The Wild West wasn't a playground for heroes. It was a place of extreme suffering. It was a place where a simple scratch could kill you, where the water could poison you, and where the person next to you smelled like a grave. But there is something respectful about knowing the truth. The people who lived through this, the real people, not the movie characters, they were tougher than any John Wayne character. They survived the lice, the rot, the cold, and the fear. They endured a life that would break most of us in 24 hours. So the next time you see a cowboy on screen, polished and pretty, remember the mud, remember the smell, and respect the real history, because it was disgusting, but it was real.